All right, so this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We've got chapter 26, Varieties of Imperialism in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, 1750 through 1914. We'll be looking at section 1, Changes and Exchanges in Africa. So one thing that I want to do first is just to identify the different geographic locations in Africa. We'll be talking about them in greater detail in each of these sections. And one point to make, or at least to remind us, is that Africa is a very large continent. And, when talking about not just the history of Africa, but the history of Africa and how it relates to the world, being familiar with the different parts of Africa and how they fit into the larger picture is relatively important here. So we'll first be talking about Southern Africa, and pretty much what we're referring to is kind of this area here at the very tip. In particular, Cape Town, as that served as a easy sort of trading city to facilitate goods going from Europe to Asia. We'll then be talking about West Africa, which is more or less this region here. In terms of Western Africa, it's really what comes below the Sahara Desert. So this is the Sahara, the largest desert on the planet. So not a lot of like civilization going on there. Certainly nomadic people who travel across the Sahara, but not sedentary permanent societies. It's more or less in Western Africa here. And some of the rivers, the Niger River, the Senegal River, these allow for pretty fruitful agricultural production, which allows for civilizations to thrive. Looking a little bit, down the coast, generally speaking, we might consider this part here, but then we have Central Africa, right, or Equatorial Africa, which is named after the equator. So anything that's referred to as equatorial or Central Africa. Also the Congo, which is right here in the middle, the Congo River. And then we have Eastern Africa, which more or less is kind of like the coast of this particular region here, right? That's kind of Eastern Africa, and a lot of trade is happening off Eastern Africa into the Indian Ocean. And then Northern Africa, which would stretch in this region here. Algeria, Egypt would be included in Northern Africa, but we can talk about Egypt and Ethiopia and being sort of Eastern Africa at the same time. So again, Southern Africa at the bottom makes kind of sense. Western Africa, again, this sort of climate here or environment where agriculture is plentiful, complex and populous civilizations can exist there. Central or Equatorial Africa. By the time you get to this point, the rainforest is, the soil in the rainforest is not quite rich enough to sustain large-scale civilizations. Certainly people inhabit those areas, but it's not the soil is not as plentiful as a place like West Africa where it can really thrive. And then East Africa really is based off of trade in the Indian Ocean. And then when you look at Northern Africa, again, the Sahara Desert begins to end in this period and you get more Mediterranean climate, especially with Egypt and the Nile River, agriculture, and therefore many more people who inhabit or live that area. So let's talk about all these different areas here and see how they fit in with this time period, 1750 to 1914. So in Southern Africa, there was what we might call a somewhat complex settlement problem going on in Southern Africa. First of all, the Zulu kingdom, which was an African kingdom. The Zulu kingdom is an African kingdom. We might call this the indigenous population. Indigenous, that is native. Maybe that's a word that we're more familiar with, right? The native population was a powerful kingdom that conquered their neighbors and was led by Shaka, sometimes called Shaka Zulu. So he was the leader of the Zulu. So they were a player in South Africa. However, the city of Cape Colony, like I mentioned before, this is a city on Africa's southern tip and was an important, we might not call it trade city because not a lot of trade was going on there, but certainly an important port city. This would be a place to stop for voyages going from Europe to India and back. So it was significant for that reason. Initially, it was settled by the Dutch, who controlled that until the British took over. So we might say about the British, we'll say took over Cape Colony from Dutch. And they did it around, we'll say around the 1800s, the year 1800, something along those lines. But the Dutch that lived in South Africa, the numbers of people who actually settled there, when we get a little bit more southwards, we'll go back to the map here. But when you start getting into this region, again, the climate turns a little bit more mild, which agriculture and more settlement communities can exist essentially. You're a little bit further away from the equator. And if you compare South Africa to the Mediterranean, it contains sort of a similar type of environment. So similar foodstuffs can be grown there. Similar animals can live in that region. It's a little bit more similar to Europe or the Netherlands in this case in terms of that type of climate. It's also true of disease, right? Whereas many diseases in more complex environments like the rainforest would leave settlers like the Dutch susceptible. Once you got a little bit lower to the southern tip of Africa, the biology, the diseases were a little bit more similar to Europe and allowed for more Europeans to live there. So the Dutch who settled essentially in Cape Colony were known as Afrikaners. So an Afrikaner is a Dutch settler in Africa. All right, so this is a Dutch settler, Dutch by bloodline, right, white, but living in Africa. And so that led, the situation in Southern Africa essentially to consist of kind of three major groups. On the one hand, there's the Zulu kingdom. On the second, there is the Dutch or the Afrikaner population. And three, there is the British. When the British took over South Africa or took over Cape Colony, the Dutch migrated further inward. The Great Trek is the migration of Dutch or Afrikaners, right? We'll call them Afrikaners, into the interior of Africa. They created new states, right? The Orange Free State, Transvaal, these are Afrikaner states, again, in South Africa. And this way, the Dutch population there, or the Afrikaner population, could be separate from British rule. And as long as these groups sort of stayed separate from one another, there was not as many issues. Although I will say that the Great Trek did put the Dutch into further conflict with some of the native population who had previously inhabited those regions. However, things got very, you might say, violent after the discovery of both diamonds and gold. So both of these were discovered in South Africa. A British, we'll just call him a British imperialist, Cecil Rhodes. In a lot of ways, Cecil Rhodes represents kind of the British desire to take over the entire world. He was largely an advocate for British expansion into Africa, and especially after the discovery of diamonds and golds, he helped create what is the world's premier diamond company, that is De Beers. So we'll call this a diamond company. And the British brought in, and the De Beers company and Cecil Rhodes promoting it, brought in a lot of infrastructure, mining equipment, railroads, all the things that were required to take over essentially very valuable diamond mines, which were discovered in South Africa. Now, this put essentially everybody in conflict with everyone. On the one hand, the British went to war with the Zulu, right? So the British had fought a number of other native people in the region, but the British matched up against Shaka and the Zulu. In particular, the Battle of, try and say this right, Isandlwana, right? This was a battle the Zulu won. It was not very often in the era of imperialism for indigenous populations to defeat colonial populations or imperialistic populations. And the main reason for that was weaponry. But in this battle in particular, the Zulu were victorious. However, the British as they say, lost the battle, but won the war. And, you know, technologies like machine guns, repeating rifles were simply too much to go up against what the Zulu were equipped with, and that was, you know, sort of shields, spears, some weapons gained from trade, but pretty rudimentary, like muskets that took a very long time to reload. And so ultimately the British did overcome the Zulu and were able to open up South Africa more so in terms of diamond mining and gold mining. However, the British also went to war with the Dutch settlers there. The Dutch initially had moved to the interior to get away from British rule, but because of the discovery of diamonds and golds, the British continued to encroach into the interior of Africa. The Boer War was a war between the Dutch and the British. And even though the British suffered defeats at the beginning and the British committed 400,000 men or so, greatly outnumbering the Dutch settler population, eventually the British also won. But in the aftermath of this victory of the Boer War, it really sort of set up what the future of Africa would be, and that is to unite both the Dutch and the British populations into the Union of South Africa. So the Union of South Africa was created by British and Dutch possessions, right, in South Africa. It was granted sort of a similar status to that of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So it was technically in British rule, but, you know, Britain granted some sort of self-government to this new country, right, South Africa. And what really kind of sealed the deal, you might say, for both the Dutch and the British populations, what they were able to agree upon in the aftermath of the Boer War was the treatment of the indigenous population. That was to enact a system of segregation in South Africa. That was to create a society where, you know, really whites excluded the African population. It was very much no longer, in the aftermath of the Boer War, it was no longer a matter of allegiance to a particular state, like I'm Dutch, I'm British, I'm Zulu. Rather, it became a simple matter of white and black. And so in terms of things like voting, holding political office, certain institutions, South Africa became what we call an apartheid state, that is a black and white society. And that was in the aftermath of the Boer War, and the Dutch and the British kind of coming to an agreement on that. Meanwhile, in Western Africa, again, Western Africa, we're sort of referring to this particular region here. There, one thing that was unique, you might say, was the long history of Islam. So Islam had existed in West Africa for, you know, by this time, you know, we could say like 800 years or so. You know, it really had been a very long time. And so in the aftermath of the last of the Western, or kind of pre-gunpowder Western African empires, you know, if we go back to whatever chapter it is, chapter 18 or something like that, we talked about the Songhai Empire and how they really controlled Western Africa. They were an Islamic kingdom in Western Africa with mosques and madrasas, you know, these Muslim centers of learning. But the Songhai Empire met its demise via raiders from the north using gunpowder weapons. And so in the aftermath of that, and that the way that Western Africa was fractioned really helped facilitate the slave trade in that various warring kingdoms in Western Africa went to war with each other frequently, captured POWs or prisoners of war, and then sold them to European merchants. In the aftermath of that, a sort of some semblance of a united kingdom in Western Africa arises with the Sokoto Caliphate. Again, Caliphate or the Caliph. The Caliph, this is a term in Islam that is the religious, military, and really kind of legal ruler. It's an all-encompassing title. And so this was a caliphate created in the interior of Western Africa, again, bounded by the religion of Islam that thrived between 1809 and 1906. However, they had to contend with imperialist powers like France, Britain, and Germany, which eventually asserted control, we'll say, over the caliphate. And again, if we go to our map here, one thing that kind of insulated the caliphate a little bit from outside powers, at least for a short time, was the fact that it was located on the interior. For the most part, Europeans had already established a very strong presence along the western coast there. In terms of the Congo Basin, if we move a little bit further down into Central Africa, King Leopold, this is the King of Belgium. Inspired by Henry Morgan Stanley. Henry Morgan Stanley was an American journalist, and he was very well known for publishing. He published accounts of Africa, and some of the things that are attributed to Henry Morgan Stanley and other journalists was to refer to Africa as a dark continent. Continent, I-E-N-T. And that was the fact that most of the interior of Africa had not been discovered by Europeans. There were changes going on in terms of like transportation, medical technology, weapon technology that made it possible, starting really around the 1800s, for Europeans and other outsiders to penetrate into the interior of Africa. And so a person like Henry Morgan Stanley sort of publishing these accounts in the newspaper about the discoveries of Africa, meeting unknown peoples, unknown animals, unknown plants. This was really something that caught the popular imagination and could sell a lot of newspapers. He was inspired, King Leopold, I should say, was inspired by Stanley to, quote unquote, bring light to, right, what was a dark continent. And he invested in Central Africa, again, under the impression that he would do good. This is sometimes referred to in this era as the civilizing mission, right, to do good for other people around the world. We will see very quickly here how King Leopold's desire to bring light or to do good was really just a guise to do something actually very evil. And so with this increased type of interaction with Africa, you might say, and the ability for new weapons, new modes of transportation due to the Industrial Revolution, new types of medical technology that made settlers immune to things like malaria, the colonization of Africa was rapidly, unfolding. The imperial powers met in Berlin. So the Berlin Conference was a meeting of imperial powers. And again, if we don't recall our definition here of what imperialism is, let's just describe it real quick. Imperialism is essentially anytime we might say a more powerful, in this case, we're just going to use the term entity. Entity, just that, entity. It seems so simple. No, there's got to be two T's in it. Yeah. A more powerful entity, there we go, quote unquote, takes over. And takes over can mean a lot of different. Takes over a less powerful one. Right, in this case, we're referring mostly to nations or countries, but they could be corporations, they could be trading companies, they could just be people not really working on behalf of any type of institution. Imperialism can also refer to something like culture, right? When one culture takes over another one. So again, the Berlin Conference was a meeting of the imperial powers. France, Britain, Germany, United States, right? These were the nations that were active in seeking out overseas territories. And what they established at the Berlin Conference was this idea of effective occupation. And that is, a nation can only claim land or territory if they, quote unquote occupy it, right? Meaning that the French can't just lay claim to all of Africa unless they actually have some sort of institution there, they have soldiers there, there has to be some sort of level of occupation. And once this was set up, this essentially led to the scramble of Africa, which was the rapid takeover. Pretty much between 18, not even that, it's really like 1880 to 1914, right? A really short period here, rapid takeover of Africa. Within a span of simply just, 35 years or so, pretty much the entire continent of Africa was taken over by outside powers using this doctrine of effective occupation and coordinating with one another so that neither of these imperial powers would kind of step on each other's toes or go to war with each other. That the British, the French, the Italians, the Germans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, they could all agree to kind of carve up Africa in ways that suited them. Of course, the principal person left out of the Berlin Conference was any representatives actually from Africa, no matter what part of the continent we're referring to. And one victor of this was Leopold II, who was the King of Belgium, and he was put personally in charge of the Congo Free State. So we'll say of Leopold here is that he personally owned, right, the Congo, which is Central Africa. And again, this idea that Leopold was to quote unquote bring light just kind of ties in with this name here, the Free State, because that's what the justification was for owning it. What was the reality? The reality was that the Congo was more or less a system of rubber farms or rubber plantations. Rubber was a very important industrial resource. There were a lot of resources following the Industrial Revolution that now had a new importance, and rubber was one of them. If you're not familiar, rubber grows on trees. And so planting the trees and then harvesting the rubber was what would be required. And as Leopold II oversaw the Congo state, essentially rubber corporations and rubber businesses came in and enslaved the Congolese population into doing all the labor that was required. And the horrors from the Congo are some of the worst that there exist in the era of imperialism. We're talking about the enslavement, the mutilation. One of the practices by, the rubber companies was that if not enough rubber was created, that they would chop off people's hands as a way to get them to work harder. And then so there are these images of people with their hands cut off, even children getting their hands cut off for not harvesting enough rubber, and just outright murder. I mean, some might even call it a genocide, and explicit and intentional mass murder of an entire demographic or ethnicity or population in that region. It wasn't until a little bit later that the world realized exactly what the horrors of Congo entailed, namely the British. And with pressure from Great Britain and pressure from Belgium, King Leopold was forced to give up his colony in the Congo, and the Belgian Congo then moved to the Belgian government in the aftermath there, but certainly one of the lowest points in all of the era of imperialism. In other areas like Egypt and Ethiopia, there were efforts at modernization, at least in the case of Egypt, right? Egypt is part of Africa, but in a lot of ways is maybe a little bit closer to the Islamic world. Certainly in a sense that it sort of shares that same culture. We can include Western Africa in here as well, right? Empires like the Sokoto Caliphate. But, in terms of trade and in terms of cultural contacts, Egypt is part of the Mediterranean world in a lot of ways. Egypt itself had experienced a few setbacks in the aftermath of Napoleon's invasion. The effort by the Egyptian Muhammad Ali to modernize Egypt didn't necessarily come to fruition. His successors continued to try to create a modern state. One geographic advantage that the Egyptians had was the Suez Canal, and this linked the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. Actually, see if Mediterranean, I don't know if it has two D's, and Indian Ocean. I think they'll have it on this map here. Let's go and take a quick peek. 1D and 2 R's is how you spell it. 1D and 2 R's. There we go. The Suez Canal, and we'll go ahead and just point it out here, linked the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. It was a very important trading route, or a very important area here. So here's the Mediterranean. The Suez Canal is right through here, right? So it allows ships to go from the Mediterranean into here and, you know, out here to India. That doesn't, that allows ships to sort of bypass the very, very long voyage that it took to go all the way around Africa. However, though, in trying to modernize, the Egyptians went incredibly into debt. This was to outside and industrial powers, so we might say indebted to the British, namely, but also the French and other nations. Meanwhile, a military uprising threatened the government, which led to the British coming in and taking over. Essentially, because of this internal military uprising, the British feared some sort of disruption to using both the Suez Canal and the ability for Egypt to pay back its debts. And so the British came in and essentially took over Egypt in an indirect way. So we might say indirect rule of Egypt. And much like in a lot of other British colonial possessions, they invested in Egypt, building the Aswan Dam, which dammed up the Nile River. Essentially allowed for more, we'll say more food production was what it did, being able to control the, more food, actually cotton is very important too, right? Not just food, but cotton that was grown there. The British used the cotton in their industrial factories, and simply the fact that they were able to control the Nile River by damming it up. A dam is a way to blockade a river, and then you could open up the dam to allow just the right amount of water that you want. This allowed for much more cotton to be produced in Egypt and head to British factories, which was, of course, important. So both cotton and the fact that the Suez Canal linked British trade with India were both important factors for why the British came in and essentially established some sort of an indirect rule in Egypt there. In Ethiopia is a little bit different in that, religiously speaking, unlike most of Africa, a Christian kingdom existed in Ethiopia for a very long time. The ruler Menelik II, so we'll call him the ruler of Ethiopia. Menelik II, the ruler of Ethiopia, appealed to European powers when the Italians invaded in the late 1800s, and his appeal to Europe was done on religious grounds, which is somewhat interesting. That is to say that Menelik said, look, we here in Ethiopia, we're a Christian nation. You in Western Europe, the French, the British, whoever you are also a Christian nation. Help us retain our independence. Essentially, Ethiopia was a kingdom surrounded by Islamic kingdoms for a very long time. The Kingdom of Ethiopia, or Christian Ethiopia, goes all the way back to like the year 800. It's been there for a very long time. In fact, even probably before that. And if we look at a map here, and especially if we consider the history of crusade, Ethiopia is right here. If we consider the major players in the region, Egypt is an Islamic state, Saudi Arabia is an Islamic state, certainly these port cities here. All of these states on the east coast of the Swahili state are Islamic. So it really is a Christian kingdom surrounded by what they would claim as hostile Islamic states, and therefore the Western powers should have a vested interest in supporting them. And one way that outside European powers did that was that they sold weapons to the Ethiopians. And so when the Italians invaded in 1896, the Battle of Ottawa, the Ethiopians defeated the Italians. Now, this was very rare for the time. In fact, it might be one of the only instances in which the overall war was successful for an African country in repelling an outside invader. But Ethiopia retained its independence, right? And that was very important because during the era of imperialism and during the scramble of Africa, there weren't many independent African states. So we might say Ethiopia defeated the Italians and retained independence. Right, one of the few areas to do that. One thing that was true of all of the continent of Africa was the relationship between outside powers and the slave trade. And during this period, Africa transitioned away from the slave trade. Probably the most significant and important aspect to that was the British abolition of the slave trade. So in 1807, the British abolished the slave trade, that is the buying and selling of slaves from Africa. And later on in the 1830s, the British abolished slavery completely. Now, there were other nations who did this. So, for example, the United States abolished the slave trade in 1808. Other nations abolished slavery. The British were pretty early to get rid of it. But the most important thing about Britain doing it was the fact that they enforced it. Because at the time, Britain had the most powerful navy. Most powerful navy in the world. And because they actually had the guns to kind of back it up, there was a dramatic decline in the slave trade, at least in the Western slave trade in the Atlantic. The slave trade was replaced by legitimate trade. Palm oil, mineral sources, rubber, all of these were in high demand due to the Industrial Revolution. These would have been goods that really didn't have all that much of a utility prior to industrialization. Mineral sources, of course, are always valuable. We're talking about iron or tin or copper or gold or silver. We saw that in the case of South Africa. But really what allowed for those sources to become more accessible was technologies like industrial mining or railroads or steamships. Palm oil was used as lubrication for the machinery to make sure that the gears kept going. And of course, rubber would be used for like various belts and stuff like that, parts of the machine as well. So these became in much more high demand due to the Industrial Revolution. And for the most part, they couldn't be gathered in Europe, right? Palm oil from palm trees don't grow in England. Rubber trees won't grow in England. The climate's not right. Mineral sources are either there or they're not. Africa is in fact very rich in mineral sources. And so slowly but surely, this legitimate trade replaced the slave trade from a century ago. There were also some important abolitionist efforts in Africa itself. Sierra Leone became a site for emancipated slaves, mainly also British missionaries, right? So British Christian missionaries moving to Sierra Leone, and that being an area or country in which emancipated slaves could live. It looks like site for emancipated slaves. And the Republic of Liberia was a colony for free slaves from the United States. So those slaves who earned their freedom or bought their freedom or became free settled in Liberia, which became a colony for freed slaves there. Meanwhile, in Eastern Africa, we might say, and there's just a little bit in your book about Eastern Africa here, is that the slave trade shifted, right? So the slave trade shifted from west to east. That is, once the British began to enforce prohibiting the Atlantic slave trade, the slave trade continued to exist in Eastern Africa. Zanzibar was a plantation island which used slave labor. Slavery wasn't abolished in Zanzibar until, the 1870s-ish. That would have been about the same time that it was being eliminated in parts of the Western Hemisphere, places like the United States, Brazil, Cuba. This is Zanzibar. Let me use a different color here. This is Zanzibar right here, right? This island right here.